जय हिंद, नमस्कार, वेलकम टू कॉन्वर्जेशंस विद कर्नल। एक बार फिर हम आपके पास आए हैं एक नया एपिसोड लेके, एंड दिस एपिसोड इज गोइंग टू बी विद अनदर सीजन्ड सिक्योरिटी डिफेंस जर्नलिस्ट, मिस्टर Sandeep Unnithan. I can speak for 20 minutes about him and the kind of work he has done. But let me start by saying that he has written two really nice books, astounding books, about Indian military actions, one in 1971 and one in 2008. We'll learn about that, and we'll learn about a lot more. So without keeping you any more away from the pearls of wisdom that we are going to get from Sandeep, Sandeep, happy to have you here, and thanks for doing this.
Delighted to be on your show, Colonel Apte.
So let me start at the start. How did it all start for you? I mean, were you always wanting to do what you're doing today, or it just the life got you to where you are today?
Well, absolutely, life got me to where I had absolutely no plan to become a journalist. So I was training to be an archaeologist. I was ancient Indian culture class of 1993, St. Xavier's College, and planning to go to Deccan College after that, and become a boring archaeologist. And then life got me into this other track.
But you're still digging up the past in one way or the other.
I am indeed.
So that's great. But what is it like? You had a background on the military, and why is defense journalism? Why not, what the regular journalists do?
Well, I guess some of it had to do with my background. My father was a naval officer, extremely fond of reading, and a deep interest in war movies, as most Fauji's are. So he would actually visit the library very often, and he'd bring back these books, these reference books. Socialist India, not everyone could afford those big, shiny,
Right.
big reference books. And he'd bring them home, he'd leave them lying around for me to read. And so that's how I kind of got my early grounding in military history. And this was in school. And that kind of, stoked my curiosity in matters military. And I started reading a lot of stuff which which was mandatory for military officers to read, whether it's your US Navy proceedings or it's Jane's Defense Weekly. So I got all that reading that normal Faujis did, thanks to this very, very curious father of mine who was very, very interested about the world around him and who read a lot. So I think a lot of that had to do with this early grounding that I got thanks to him.
So I think it was military's gain that you turned out to be smarter and became a journalist and not join the military.
Well, I think if everyone joined the military, there wouldn't be anyone to write stories about them. So I think I got onto that track of defense journalism, writing about the military, and I think I've come across some fascinating stories while I've been at it for the last nearly 2 decades now.
Wow. I have had the chance of looking over some of your stories and the kind of work you've done. But I'm sure you have interacted with Indian military for a long time. Would you recall some, incidents, good, bad, ugly, funny, with the military, which you are going to take to your grave?
Well, there are some very lasting memories of the Indian military, particularly of the Indian Army, which actually have to do with the conduct of the military and the army in HADR, in humanitarian assistance and disaster
Relief.
response. This was in October of 2005. It's so vivid. You had the Kashmir earthquake.
Correct.
I had reached Uri because that was one of the epicenters of the earthquake. You had literally villages, devastated, landslides.
Flattened. Everything flattened.
Everything was flattened. Brigadier, later Lieutenant General Huda, was the brigade commander at Uri. And
Right.
I remember that was his brigade area that I was in. I had met him earlier also, so he kind of helped us get around. I was at India Today magazine in those days, and I remember trekking to one of those forward locations near where the Indian Army posts had been devastated because both armies on both sides, the Pakistan military, of course, because the epicenter was inside Muzaffarabad, they were heavily affected, but so were our soldiers. My abiding memory of that incident was that the Indian Army, despite having their posts knocked out, literally collapsed, you had entire forward area, bases and all that knocked out, roofs had collapsed, troops were sleeping out in the open, in sleeping bags. Despite all of that, they were helping the locals. With relief, supply, setting up things for them, food, water, shelter, all of that. And that to me was like what the Indian Army was all about. That they didn't care for their own shelter, their own safety. For them, it was all about looking after the people around them. So that's a memory that I will, literally take to my grave. And another little memory was of this small little post that we had come up to. It was manned by Gorkhas. And I remember that Subedar Major Saab was there in a tent. And he was absolutely calm, as cool as a cucumber. And he was in a sleeping bag. I think it was early in the morning sometime. And he was calmly issuing instructions to his soldiers. And he saw us come over there with some civilians. And he said, the first thing that he asked us was, have you guys eaten? So we said, no, we've been, literally trekking for the last couple of hours. He said, acha, inke liye ye khana laga do, straight away. So they took their rations and they fed us. So I thought that was,
amazing.
It was just, it's one of the most delicious meals that I have ever eaten in my life. It was rajma chawal from that MREs that they cooked
Very
for us.
simple
Right?
fare.
Simple food, but it was that very warm gesture from a small little post that had been completely shattered. So Vedar Major Saab under a tent and he's, feeding us. So that to my mind was the ethos of the Indian Army.
I think very well brought out, Sandeep. I think absolute ethos from what you learn
Yes.
right in the basics of military academies.
Service before self and people before self. That's what the army really is all about.
And Indian Army is the people's army. It's
Yes.
not an occupation force. It's not somebody
Absolutely.
else who's, it's not doing anyone else's bidding. So it's right that they are actually working with the people, for the people, and for the betterment of the people. Incidentally, since you mentioned that they offered you food and all that, as a culture, and I've been in corporate for some time, as a culture, there is a very simple thing that any defense officer or a JCO you meet, and he comes in a vehicle, when he gets out or gets in, first thing he will do is ask the driver कि आपने खाना खाया है, कि पानी पिया है, आपके रहने का बंदोबस्त क्या है? Which I have not seen outside.
Yes.
So I think I totally relate to what you said, and I think that battalion must have been doing a really good job out there. So moving on, let me take you to the book that you wrote, and it's a fabulous book. I read it.
Thanks.
And this is the image of the cover of the book. Sandeep, the popular imagination of the Bangladesh war, and that is your second book, in fact,
Yes.
Operation X, is that it was an Army and Air Force war.
Right.
And we know that Navy also has done its bit.
Yes.
Navy sacrificed a lot of lives. More so, commando operations are something which are thought that this is Indian Army's prerogative,
Right.
or para commandos or special
Yes.
forces. But this was something different, completely different, right? Naval special forces or naval commandos operating in a foreign country and rendering some outstanding results that the Secretary of State of US is wondering, who's doing this?
Kissinger.
Kissinger.
Yes.
So what is it all about? I mean,
Well, as you brought out the fact that a lot of people seem to think it's a Navy, it's an Air Force and Army operation, but the Indian Navy was acutely aware of the fact that something like a 1965 could possibly happen to them again. In 1965, as you know, the Air Force and the Army went into war with Pakistan. The Navy was kept out of it. To the point when the Pakistan Navy attacked Gujarat, they shelled Dwarka, as you know. There was a surface action group of the Pakistan Navy that came. The Indian Navy was not given orders to engage them because there had been some order that had been passed by the government to say that the Navy shall stay out of this war. We shall fight it only on land. Whereas the first thing they should have done was to activate the Navy, because the numbers that we had were more than what the Pakistan Navy could muster. Obviously, it was a bigger Navy then, but this seed came into the mind of Admiral Nanda, who was, like a lot of other naval officers, incensed the fact that the Navy sat out of the 1965 war. He made it a point to ensure that the Navy of 1971, if there was ever a war in the future, the Navy would be absolutely front and center. And this is what they did in 71. If you look at the kind of operations that the Indian Navy did, much more with much less. They towed missile boats and they launched the largest ship-to-ship missile attack in naval history.
On Karachi Harbour.
On Karachi Harbour, they destroyed a Pakistani naval destroyer, a minesweeper, a merchant ship. They attacked ships in port. They set fire to the oil farms at Kiamari. These are the kind of operations that had been only thought possible in the realm of fiction until then. Like anti-ship missile, mass use of missile boats going and firing salvo after salvo of missiles. In the east, another theatre, you have the INS Vikrant with a broken, patched up boiler, barely making any speed, launching waves of fighter and bomber aircraft against shore targets in East Pakistan. And the third operation, which was the biggest and the most secret of them all, was Naval Commando Operations X, which was the Indian Navy, specifically Naval Intelligence, operating directly under the Navy Chief, Admiral Nanda, that set up this very large body of Bangladeshi Naval Commandos. And at a time when the Indian Navy itself did not have Naval Commandos of its own. Pakistan had SSG Navy. The Indian Navy had no such equivalent. What they had was a diving branch. So you had Indian naval divers training Bangladeshi Mukti Bahini fighters to become naval commandos. So the first naval commandos were actually produced out of these camps that the Navy set up from April to May of 1971, culminating in their first wave of attacks in August, even before the actual conflict began, because these were operations in support of a friendly regime of Bangladesh, their government in exile. So these operations are of a kind that we haven't seen anywhere in the world, of a size and scale that no other country has kind of possibly imagined. 400 plus naval commandos being trained as saboteurs, limpetiers, to carry out limpet mine attacks on merchant ships. And this was an operation of a kind that had last been seen possibly in the Second World War and after that in the Vietnam War. So this was Navy doing overt action when a full-scale war had been called in December. And preceding that, you had a 4-month-long covert naval guerrilla operation that was planned, implemented with a very small corps of naval divers officers, just about 20 men, and they were running gunboats. It was like the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. This was the Indian avatar of that in 1971. And of course, it was entirely due to the efforts of the Bangladeshi fighters, the Mukti Bahini men who literally sacrificed their all. And these were the fighters on the ground, while the Navy stood behind the international border. They planned, resourced, trained, conducted all these operations. The actual fighting was done by the Mukti Bahini men, the surface action groups, the combat swimmers of the Mukti Bahini, who literally staked their lives, put their lives on the line, not only their own lives, but the lives of their families, friends, relatives. Because if they were caught, they would not only be brutally tortured, but their families would be picked up and tortured and killed, which is what was going on at that time in 1971. You know, it was a genocide against the Bengalis of East Pakistan. So against all of these odds, you had not only the Bangladeshis fighting this war, but you had the Indian Navy, which was, as you know, the Cinderella service. It got the smallest of the defense budget, smallest portion of the defense budget. And their efforts were largely due to the fact that the naval leadership realized that if we don't deploy and show the country what we are capable of, it's quite possible that the Navy itself would be irrelevant for the
times
future.
To come. Yeah. Two things come to mind, Sandeep. One is, while reading the book, I realized that the operation, as you said, is unprecedented in scale.
Yes.
To the audience, I would mention that imagine hundreds of people with mines strapped to their bodies, floating downriver, finding Pakistani ships, whether they are military ships, whether they are transport ships, at night, and then attaching these mines to the hulls of these ships, and then floating away, causing mayhem in that particular part of the river. And also incidents of people getting caught under the propellers of the ship and losing their lives. So, as you said, and very well said, Sandeep, that a lot of credit on this needs to go to the Bangladeshis for the way they
Absolutely.
did and
They
the way
did
they
all
fought.
the fighting. No one can take that away from them. That this Operation X, at least, and the Mukti Bahini operations of the Naval Commandos was all due to the fighting will of the Naval Commandos who came. They sacrificed everything. Literally, all these operations that were carried out were done by the Mukti Bahini themselves. The Indian Navy didn't do the fighting, but they did the planning and the organizing. But the actual fighting was done by the Bangladeshis, the freedom fighters on the ground, and in the water in this case.
Absolutely. And the second thing what I thought I'll mention is in Staff College in India, our naval counterparts always show the map upside down,
Yes.
right? And they say that while our land borders are what they are, our maritime borders are actually our 2/3 of our borders, or
Yes.
2-3 times our borders. And I think Government of India has taken notice of this. There is a lot of progress happening in Navy, and Navy itself is going from being the silent service
Yes.
to be a more robust and a more stronger organization as time goes by. But let's cut to your first book. As
Right.
it's about 2611, the 3 sieges of 2611,
Yes.
and that is near home. I mean, near time. It's just about 15 years back now, 15, 20 years back. And you wrote about a city where you grew up, Mumbai, where I grew up too, and the kind of mayhem that Pakistani terrorist caused on those 2 or 3 nights. And the book is got a wonderful cover. It looks beautiful, and I would really urge the listeners to read this book, because there are passages in this book which even I wasn't aware of, and I was in service at that time. And there are incidents of sheer fearlessness and bravery by people like ASI Tukaram Omble, who was actually instrumental in giving us kasab. Otherwise,
Yes.
there was no kasab, no case for us. Where do you think the government went wrong in responding to these attacks at that time? And do you think they could have responded differently once these attacks took place in response to what Pakistan had unleashed upon us?
Absolutely. And to answer that question, I want to take you back a bit in time to somewhere in the 1970s. And this relates to 1971 as well. Because after the dismemberment of Pakistan, and dismemberment is like, Pakistan is a country that's literally split into half. It's a freak of geography. That country
Correct.
should not have existed the way it did. And when it actually broke away, East Pakistan became Bangladesh, as you know. West Pakistan was in an identity crisis, and they decided to go in for nuclear weapons to preserve what was left of West Pakistan. And they went hell for leather for nuclear weapons, as President Bhutto was later...
We'll eat grass, but
We'll
we'll
eat grass, yes. And, well, they have nuclear weapons today, and they are
They are
eating
eating
grass. So, as things stood in the 1970s, they went hell for leather to get nuclear weapons. And by the early 80s, the date is somewhere 1984, is when they are believed to have acquired those weapons. But moving on to Pakistan. So when Pakistan got the nuclear weapons in the 1980s, what you actually saw was a change in the outlook of the Pakistan army itself.
They became aggressive?
They started doing what I believe is the only example of NWET in the world, which is nuclear weapons enabled terrorism. The shield of nuclear weapons protecting the sword of terrorism. So beginning from the 1980s, you saw the Pakistan army, which was then a frontline state in the war against the Soviet Union inside Afghanistan. All of the resources that were going in to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan from the West and the United States was flowing through Pakistan. The ISI, which was a tiny organization, became supersized. Pakistan's covert capabilities became supersized. So by 1988, when the Soviets left Afghanistan, you had this monster called the Inter-Services Intelligence, which was this behemoth that was created by this Afghan war. And then it starts looking around. The Pakistan military starts looking around and say, hey, let's do this in India. You have Kashmir, you have Punjab. And they went in all guns blazing, covert guns blazing in Punjab first and later in Jammu and Kashmir. And in the 90s, they start becoming adventurous. They say, it's working in Punjab and Kashmir. There's been no response from the Indian state because of nuclear weapons. Everyone's afraid of this covert bomb in the basement. Let's expand this a bit. Let's go to Mumbai. And there you have 1993, the ISI stroke Pakistan Army's first attack on Mumbai, Bombay back then. 13 bomb blasts, all planned, executed, implemented by the Pakistan Army, the ISI. Dawood Ibrahim's men were just the planters. They were the facade for this whole thing, the cutouts. And you had something like nearly 300 people, civilians, killed brutally. Till 9/11, these were the worst urban attacks on any city in the world. Ever. In 93. That went unpunished. So they get emboldened. 2006. 7 train bombings in Mumbai. Commuter trains are bombed. There's no response. That's further emboldens them. And just 2 years after that, you have one of the most complex, complicated urban assaults on a city that you saw in 26/11. And when I wrote that book, my first thoughts were that this entire blueprint was something that was so easily replicatable by any other terror group. And so my book ends with those lines, which I wrote in 2014. I said, the frightening aspect of this terror plot was that many other copycat terror organizations could pick it up and copy it and do it. And this is exactly what ISIS did. I even pointed to ISIS. ISIS used that to attack Paris in 2016. And you had Al-Qaeda, many other such terror organizations picked it up. But this, in its bare essence, was actually a Pakistan military attack. It was a naval amphibious assault where you had a team of special 10 of these so-called elite fighters who had actually been trained by Pakistan Special Forces, who had been resourced by the Navy, Pakistan Navy. The planning for this had been done by the Pakistan Navy. We know that thanks to David Headley. They had been infiltrated. This is exactly how Naval Commandos are trained. Marine Commandos trained that way. They are covert insertion near an enemy harbor or an airbase. They're infiltrated using rubber boats, or they swim ashore. Once they hit the shore with the rubber boats or by swimming, they hit the shore and they break up into buddy pairs and they go after various targets. They hit the targets, they exfiltrate, covertly extracted from there. This kind of a naval amphibious assault was done exactly the way 26/11 was done this way, minus the part of the exfiltration, which they then rejected because they said it's too risky. We want to make this attack look like an attack where Indians have attacked Indians. And if you see that entire very elaborate deception plan, that was Plan B, which was the deception plan that all of these terrorists, the 10 terrorists, had identity cards with a college in Hyderabad to make it look like they were
locals.
They were Indian students from Hyderabad. They had red threads on their hands just to pass them off as locals. The idea was that when the bodies were found, they were all meant to die fighting, all 10 of them. All 10 of them were meant to die fighting. And when the bodies were found, you would see a lot of conspiracy theories floating. Correct. That, they had Indian names, they had ID cards from a Hyderabad college, and they were actually Indians. There were no Pakistanis because they had counted on the fact that the Kuber, the fishing trawler that they hijacked, would be sunk off Mumbai with the GPS set and the SATCOM and all of that. All 10 would die fighting. And this deception plan would then be set into motion, and you had people in India who were writing all these conspiracy theory books. All this, I believe, was part of that deception plan.
Complete deniability
of this covert attack that was carried out by the Pakistan state, the covert deep state of Pakistan. And we all know what happened. The Kuber didn't sink. You found the GPS set, you found the SATCOM with the waypoints all the way pointing straight to Karachi. And you had Tukaram Ombli, that very, very brave Mumbai policeman who grappled with Ajmal Kasab, because of which that entire plan went awry, because we know then, after Kasab was captured, that this was the plan all along. And he spilled the beans literally. And we knew it was a Pakistan deep state plot, thanks to that. So what happened was 26/11, like I said, was a series of attacks that Mumbai had been attacked for 15 years. And with every attack not being punished or the red lines weren't indicated, the Pakistan deep state got emboldened. And in their mind, they believed that they had this maniacal obsession with targeting Mumbai. The fact that we did not punish those attacks, we did the biggest disservice to India by not punishing those attacks, despite knowing the fact that all of these three attacks were carried out by cutouts, and you always had the hand of the Pakistan deep state. You knew the DGISIs at those points. In 2006 and 2008, it was Ashfaq Parvez Kayani who was the DGISI. In 1993, you knew someone who was a hardcore religious fundamentalist who was the DGISI at that time, who had been involved, who had been called out by the United Nations for supplying weapons to insurgents across the globe. Despite all of this, we somehow didn't raise the costs for the Pakistan deep state or even the Pakistan army, which is actually the deep state in Pakistan.
So, cut to today, and we see something very similar playing out in the area of Jammu.
Yes.
Right, for last almost three months now, there have been incidents, a lot of incidents and accidents, and a lot of terrorist actions. And while 3 months is just what has happened now, this has been going on for almost 2-3 years. If you look at even what has happened in Rajouri, and we see that there's been no retaliation. Why is that? What is stopping India from retaliating, especially when India changed the tack in surgical strikes, changed the tack in Balakot, and then there was a relative peace. So why not now?
Possibly this is the lull before the storm, for all you know. There must be something in the works, because from what I understand is that this government, particularly the national security establishment of the Modi government, understands the Pakistan deep state better than any previous government, with the possible exception of Mrs. Gandhi's government, who understood the way the Pakistan deep state functioned, the Pakistan military functioned. And this present government's national security establishment understood this when they authorized the surgical strikes way back in 2016 and the airstrikes on Balakot in 2019. And these options had always been on the table for decades, at least going back to the attack on Parliament, when for the first time the Air Force proposed surgical strikes, airstrikes against terror training camps. And a lot of the planning had already begun by then. We know from accounts by former service chiefs who said that there were these options for using Mirages precisely in the way they were in 2019 that existed back then. It all boils down to political will, really. It's not about the military or whether the military has the capability or any of that. It's always how the political leadership looks at things. It is all really about political will, the political leadership, how the politician sees things. What are the actions that are available to him, and what will be the consequences of an action that he carries out? What would be the response to that? And to my mind, one of the biggest fears in the minds of the Indian political class from the 1980s to the 90s was the nuclear bomb that Pakistan had. So the Pakistan nuclear weapon program was not about deterring the Indian military, really, because the Indian military can fight through a nuclear weapons exchange. They're trained for that. It was about deterring the Indian political leadership. So when the first Pakistani F-16 flew with a nuclear weapons, with a bomb under its belly, Pakistan had achieved deterrence, because it had to deter the Indian politicians from holding back against launching a full-scale conventional ground assault of the kind that we'd seen in 1971, which would end Pakistan possibly as a viable political unit.
So probably in hindsight, I think the smartest thing Pakistanis have done, which has prevented it from going the Iraq way, is to get a nuclear bomb. But for that, probably the whole geopolitics of the region would have been different. You could have had the repercussions of actions taken against US.
Right.
US, like they moved in Iraq or Afghanistan, they could have also moved in Pakistan. But because Pakistan had a bomb, not only did it prevent Indians from retaliating conventionally against Pakistan, possibly also aligned US towards, mollycoddling Pakistan to an extent.
Well, there is a reason for Pakistan's existence from 1947, and there's a lot of literature on that which suggests that Pakistan itself was created as a hedge and a wedge between India and the Soviet Union. And the West needed something here in South Asia to hold its interests, to hold up its interests, and to balance against a powerful India, a regional superpower that could emerge. And Pakistan has been fulfilling that destiny for 70 years since then. And if you look at it, Pakistan is a state, it's a rentier state, which exists because of its peculiar geography. It is at the center of a very interesting place in the world, close to the Persian Gulf. It has borders with China, it has borders with Afghanistan, and it suits a lot of Western powers to have interests in Pakistan. So the great outreach between Nixon and Mao was facilitated by Yahya Khan in 1971.
When Kissinger went to Pakistan and then flew to Beijing.
Absolutely. So Pakistan is a rentier state which uses its geopolitical location. It's like a local dalal. So he does all his, he does all his the local stuff that you need, stuff done in Afghanistan or in Iran or in China or all around its border, or maybe even in India. You balance India, you deal with China, you attack Afghanistan, attack Iran, prop up the Pakistan military. So that's how, these are the games that big powers play, and Pakistan's played along.
Sandeep, I'll take you back to your books, and there is a common thread in both these books. Operation X could not have been done without the support of Air Force and Army.
Yes.
Although Navy took the lead on that. And even in 2611, we saw Naval Marine Commandos who did a stellar job. So we keep coming up with this thing about jointmanship and joint operations in some way or the other, where three services combine their forces or work together, and the output is much larger than a single service. And there has been a lot of talk in the media and in the political circles and the military circles about joint theatre commands, jointness among the armed forces. You live in Delhi, you are privy to a lot of internal conversations and a lot of the noise that comes out of South Block. What's happening there?
Well, it's a great question. But I'll answer the first part of it first. Both these books, interestingly, are connected in some way. Because my second book, incidentally, if you look at the timeline, 1971 and 2008, 37 years apart. One of the final conclusions of the operation, at the end of the operation, Captain Samant, the great guy who carried out this operation, he was the man on the ground in Kolkata, my co-author, he passed away in 2019, Mahavir Chakra winner. He wrote out a report for the government and the Indian Navy where he specifically wrote down saying that we need to raise a Marine Commando force. Two recommendations that he made. The first is that you need to raise a Marine Commando force. The second one is beware of Pakistan trying a similar operation against us, which is to attack merchant shipping or to infiltrate naval commandos.
Both almost happened.
And both almost happened, because the interesting part is that the government acted on his recommendations almost 15 years later, where you had in 1986, you had the Indian Naval Marine Commando Force set up, 86. And I think one of the greatest operations that the Marine Commandos have done in nearly 4 decades of their existence has been their intervention on the night of 26/11. Because as you know, the first force that made contact with these terrorists at the Taj were the Marcos. In hindsight, I was just thinking about the coincidence that it was the recommendations of Captain Samant that resulted in the formation of the Marcos, and that resulted in this 150 hotel guests being saved. and incredible operation by the Marcos, without which the death toll in Mumbai would have been possibly 400 or 500 civilians killed.
And he had great foresight, because when you see what Pakistan did, and you said that it was almost a military operation,
Yes.
albeit done with
With
non-state
civilians,
actors
yes,
or
civilian
civilians,
deniable,
completely
yes,
deniable,
operation.
non-attributable. His prediction came true,
Yes.
almost.
And coming to your second part of the question, there is no way ahead but to fight jointly. And I've seen that in 15 odd years of reporting on the defense services in Delhi, that they have wonderful services, but they're all in silos of their own. The Navy fights its own battle, the Air Force fights its own war, air war, the Army fights its own land battle. And these are three engines that if they came together to fight as one, as they did in 1971, or even in a limited way as they had done in 2611, when you had the Marine Commandos, you had the NSG, which is all Army, and you had the Air Force that flew them in. The kind of potential that all these services could unleash if they fought together jointly, if they jointly planned, trained and operated, it would be fantastic. It would be a force multiplier of the kind that we use so loosely. Think of all these brains coming together from all the three services and planning jointly, training jointly, carrying out operations jointly. This is something that we really need to be done. This should have been done not yesterday, but day before yesterday. But the larger question of us not having learned our lessons of jointmanship from 1971, that's one of the biggest conundrums, that why we didn't institute a joint military structure post 1971, because this was very clearly the way forward. You didn't have to wait for Goldwater Nichols in 1986. You already did that in 71. You had to institutionalize that structure, create a very powerful joint services, tri-services kind of command, which would fight these kind of future wars together, so that the Navy is not doing its own thing, Air Force isn't doing its own thing, and certainly the Army is not fighting its own battle on its own. Because then when you look at pooling in all of these resources together, and this I've understood through my conversations with General Rawat and then later with General Chauhan, the two CDSs, where they've said that when we train in services, it's only after a certain point that you understand the capabilities of another service.
Absolutely.
The kind of force multipliers that, say, the Air Force has at its command, the kind of heavy lift that the Air Force has, the kind of surveillance assets that the Indian Navy has, which it uses over the oceans, which can be then used over land. All of these things should come naturally to us in a joint services establishment, which is, to my mind, one of the biggest misses in our past 50 years, that we did not learn those lessons from 1971. Then Kargil, and then you had the Kargil Review Committee report that came out.
Who recommended the same thing?
Which recommended that this is the very obvious thing to do. You need to have joint structures. So you wouldn't have this very unsightly thing of services fighting amongst themselves. The Army saying that the Air Force didn't come when it needed to, and the Air Force saying, oh, well, we thought it was, we don't want to be, subservient to the Army and knocking out bunkers. We want to fight a strategic air war, and therefore the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister to intervene and, bring them together. Those kind of things would, to a large extent, have been avoided if we had those joint structures in place post 1971. But we waited far too long, and even now, half a century after 1971, we are still debating joint commands. Hopefully this should happen in the near future with the kind of mandate that the CDS has been given. The first CDS was, of course, given the mandate. His tenure was unfortunately cut very short by that very tragic accident, but General Chauhan is now the man on the ground, and he has a year now to implement this, and that's absolutely front and center for him to do in the next couple of months, we think.
Absolutely, and it's very unfortunate when forces get left out of battle.
Yes.
You mentioned right at the beginning of the conversation about 65, where Navy was left out. In 62, because of bad planning and bad inputs, the Air Force was left out. And had Air Force been used in 62, maybe the
Yes.
result would have been a little different.
Absolutely. If the Indian Air Force had joined the battle, you could possibly have seen a very different outcome of the 1962 war.
So now we come to the end of episode 1 of this podcast. We have heard some great stories and great instances and great experiences from Sandeep. We'll carry on this next week, same time. Till then, thank you so much for being with us.